So remember, there's three major reasons why your body isn't healing. And that's number one, you're too toxic. Number two, there's missing nutrients. And number three, your vitality is too low. So even though the nutritional section really focuses on missing nutrients, really all these three pillars are tied into each month. So we're going to talk about some toxicity and some vitality today as well. So, what part of your body is not 100% made of what you eat, drink, breathe, absorb, and think? Right? This seems fairly obvious and rational and logical, but I think it's easy to forget this fact that, how else is our cells remaking themselves and turning over as quickly as 4 days in the gastrointestinal system and up to 8 months in the brain. So literally every 8 months, every cell in your body is new, and there's different cells that turn over quicker than others. But the nutrients and resources for our cells to remake themselves have to come from somewhere, and a huge portion of where our cells come from and how they're remade is from what we eat, of course. So why are we all depleted? There's four major reasons why all of us are depleted in nutrients. Number one is depletion of the soil. Number two, the globalization of food. Number three, the chemicalization of food. And then number four, loss of traditional food. So we're going to talk about each one of these. So first, the depletion of the soil. This image here is actually from the Hunza Valley. They called the Hunza Valley the Shangri-La, which is it's almost like a utopia. And what they did in the Hunza Valley is they actually built these terraces along the mountain wall. So glacial melt would melt off the side of the mountain, and it would catch the water in these terraces, and that glacial melt coming off the mountainside carried with it tons and tons of minerals. Actually, the children in the Hunza Valley would play a game where they would go up, climb up the side of the mountain and look for goat stool so that they could put it in their parents' garden to compost the soil. So it's no wonder why the people in the Hunza Valley lived well over 100 and were extremely healthy. It was one of the original blue zones, so to speak, that was studied extensively throughout the 1900s because the people in the Hunza Valley were so healthy. And this is one of the major reasons why, because their soil was so replete with nutrients. Here's a farmer in the Hunza Valley. You can see how healthy this man is. This photo was taken actually recently. So, people living off the land in this way are still maintaining wonderful health, even in the modern time. The issue now is that we farmed our soil so extensively, especially in America, that we've experienced lots of soil erosion and huge loss of nutrients. So, if we're not composting and repleting the soil with good nutrients, then there's no other place for us to get nutrients. That's built into traditional farming practices. And when you have industrial agriculture, it doesn't really set up a situation to allow the soil to be as powerful as possible. So the loss of traditional, I'm sorry, trace minerals and other nutrients in the soil is extreme in the modern time. For example, this is a table that shows an 80-year decline in the mineral content of an apple. So we have calcium, phosphorus, iron, potassium, and magnesium. You see in 1914, we had these high levels of these minerals. By 1963, we're seeing a significant drop in most of these minerals in the content of the apple. And then by 1992, drops even further. So we see the percentage change over the course of 80 years in the mineral content of an apple. And this is the case across the board. No matter what food or crop we look at, no matter what animal food we look at, the mineral loss and vitamin loss in our food has been very significant, and that's because the soil is no longer replete with the nutrients, because that's where all the nutrients come from originally, is the soil. Okay, number two is the globalization of food. Of course, traditionally people would get their food locally from local farms, or they'd grow it themselves. So obviously the best uh, way to get your food is from a farmer's market. And the reason why is because if you're getting local food, it wasn't picked very long ago. So there hasn't been a long time the plant has been off of the vine or the plant. And the longer the food is off the vine, the more the vitamin and mineral content drops. So when you eat locally, you're getting local food that's been grown by small farms. So the soil content is probably much better, and it hasn't been off the vine nearly as long. So the transportation time and the time from farm to table is much less. So that's really the ideal standard. Also, when you eat locally and you eat at a farmer's market, you're eating with the seasons as well. And that's a much more natural way to eat with the seasons than, eating tropical food in the middle of winter that's shipped, all across the world in order to get to your grocery store. Now, of course, with the globalization of the whole world and the globalization of food specifically, food is shipped from all over the world to get to our grocery store. So, of course, there's benefits of that. We get a whole variety of various foods that we can't cultivate locally. Especially that's the case with various products, packaged products that are of different ethnic origin. However, there is, of course, a downside to this in that the vitamin and mineral loss in these foods is significant. So you can see here that various foods primarily come from different regions around the earth. Um, of course, this map is just a generalization, but it just goes to show, how extensively globalized our system is. And our food really comes from all over the place. And again, it's a positive and a negative, and the negative being that there's a nutrient loss when food is off of the vine for that long of a period of time during transport. So here's some tables looking at the loss of ascorbic acid, which is vitamin C, in various foods. And it compares in the first table a fresh food in the fridge after 7 days at 20 degrees Celsius, and then at 4 degrees Celsius. And we can see that at 20 degrees Celsius, just refrigerated, the nutrient content actually stays much higher. This is, again, the loss of percentage of vitamin C. So we do get loss in those 7 days from just the food sitting in the fridge. If it's colder at 4 degrees Celsius, we even get a greater loss in some cases. Green beans, we see a little bit of a difference from the 20 degrees Celsius, but most of the other foods, we're getting a greater loss. And then it compares it to frozen at negative 20 degrees Celsius after 12 months, and we get a significant loss in the vitamin C content. So you can see that even after 7 days, the vitamin C content is already half in most cases. And then if we freeze it or cool it down further than that, then we get an even greater loss. So you can imagine that with transportation times that are, sometimes well over a week, the kind of nutrient loss that we're talking about. And then this second table compares canning and freezing and the loss of vitamin C in those processes with these various foods. And again, we see a significant loss of vitamin C in the canning process, not as significant in the blanching and freezing, but still quite significant, well over 50% with some of these vegetables. So, you layer on the transportation time and the loss of nutrients with that process on top of the already nutrient depleted soil, and you can see how our food is very nutrient depleted. Okay, number 3, the chemicalization of food. So, in order to talk about the chemicalization of food, we're going to talk about the top 5 dietary toxins. Number one is conventional and genetically modified foods. Two is vegetable oil. Three is white sugar, white flour, white salt. Number four, factory farmed animal food. And number five, chemical additives. And we're going to go through these one by one. So the first thing is conventional and genetically modified crops. The amount of pesticides and fertilizers that we use in the modern time has gone up and up and up through the last 100 years. And one of the reasons for this is because as the soil content gets depleted, we have to add more and more fertilizer in order to, allow the plants to even grow normally. And we're just talking about like the bare minimum amount of minerals that the soil needs in order to allow the plants to grow. And when you grow food in an industrial manner like this, where there's monocropping and there's large acreage of just one crop, it really destroys the biodiversity of the land. And of course, it's hard to grow a mass amount of food for a large amount of people without doing some of these practices of single crops in one field. Ultimately, the best way to grow that much food is to kind of rotate the crops seasonally. However, to a large extent, we don't do that, and because the biodiversity is so minimal in these farms, it makes the plants very susceptible to various pests. And then we have to use higher and higher amounts of pesticides in order to protect the plants because there is no biodiversity that naturally creates species to protect the plants from the various pests. So here are tables that just show how significant the rise has been in the amount of pesticides that we're using in the U.S. So the table on the left here shows the pesticide production and pesticide imports over the last 50 years up to 2000, and we can see it's a significant rise. And then this second graph shows the amount of fertilizers that we're using, nitrogen and phosphorus. And we can again see the rise in those over the years as our soil has become depleted. Again, here's another table showing kind of the global amount of pesticide usage around the world. You can see in the States here, we have a fairly significant amount of pesticide use, not as much as some other places, but still fairly significant. So this is looking at average pesticide application per unit of cropland as far as kilograms per hectare. So we're in the range of, between 2.5 kilograms and 5 kilograms per hectare of cropland. So it's quite a bit. And this was done in 2017. Here's another look at just how much more toxic the pesticides have become, because not only are we using more pesticides, but as our technology increases, the pesticides can become more and more toxic, and they oftentimes have a low half-life, meaning that they stay around in the soil for a long period of time. So as we can see, just over the course of 12 years from 1992 to 2014, the toxicity of pesticides to honeybees specifically has gone up significantly. And we're seeing a huge decline in honeybee populations, which is it's very damaging and dangerous to our food system, because so much of our crops are contingent upon fertilizing honeybees that will pollinate pollinating honeybees that will pollinate the plants in order to allow them to grow. So without those honeybee populations, then we may be seeing declines in a lot of our major crops that we use. This is just another graph, again, showing the rise in toxicity of the pesticides to honeybees. So very significant. So the Environmental Working Group every year produces a list of what they call their Dirty Dozen, which is basically the 12 most contaminated foods with pesticide residues. And they release this list every year. Strawberries and spinach have been the worst offenders for 4 years in a row. And then we see the other foods here: kale, nectarines, apples, grapes, peaches, cherries, pears, tomatoes, celery, and potatoes. So we always recommend that you eat organic for many reasons. One of them being that organic foods contain much less pesticide use. So we recommend organic for everything, but at the very least, make sure you get organic for these foods because these foods have the highest amount of pesticide residue. And then genetically modified organisms are kind of their own beast because basically what genetically modified organisms are is that we're splicing genes into the DNA of these various plants and even animals like salmon in order to have them express different genes to make them more susceptible to or more resistant to pesticides or various insects or drought, or express different traits. So these are the foods that are currently in our system that are genetically modified. Some of them have not been released to the public yet, but they're kind of in production. The major ones that we need to look out for are corn, sugar beets, which is basically sugar. We either get our sugar from sugar cane or sugar beet. Soy, canola, which is used extensively throughout the food industry. Um, let's see what else. Salmon is in production, rice is in production. Some of these other foods are in production, so they're not yet in our food system, but they're going to be. And the problem with genetically modified foods is that we just don't have enough understanding or data on how these foods affect people long term, because ultimately we've tinkered with the genes. So does that affect our genes? We don't really know. Some of the studies that I have seen suggest that high amounts of these genetically modified foods can lead to cancer and other tumors and other chronic issues long term. So they definitely pose a potential risk, but we just don't know how big of a risk that is. The other issue with genetically modified foods is that oftentimes they produce traits like a resistance to pesticides. So, for example, you may have heard of Roundup Ready corn, which is a genetically modified version of corn that is resistant to Roundup. So what they'll do is they will cover the field in Roundup, and this corn, all the weeds will die and all the other plants will die because that's what Roundup does. It's a weed killer, but the corn is resistant to it, so it will not die. So it's very easy to apply the pesticide and just cover the entire field and then not worry about killing the corn. But of course, then the corn is absorbing those nutrients or those chemicals. So even though the corn isn't dying, we're still ultimately eating that in the final product. The three white demons is another one of the top 5 dietary toxins. We call the three white demons white salt, white sugar, and white flour. And each of these kind of has its own story. So we're going to go through each of those. The first one we'll go through is white flour. The problem with white flour is that essentially you take a whole kernel of wheat and you separate the bran from the germ of the wheat. So all the nutrients are in the bran and the germ, and you have to separate that out in order to make white flour. So the only thing that's left is just basically the carbohydrate. All the vitamins and minerals are in the germ and the bran. So you can see all the steps that the kernel goes through in order to separate out the bran here, and then the germ here, and then patent flour is basically white flour that's the final byproduct. The big issue with this, of course, is that we're totally depleting the food of all of the actual nutrients that make it a health food. People have eaten bread and wheat and other grains for thousands and thousands of years. It's been a staple of some cultures' diets. But back in the 1900s, when they first developed this process and they started pulling off the germ and the bran to make white flour, children were being born with severe developmental issues because they were totally vitamin depleted. So once we actually had an understanding of vitamins and minerals, because vitamins were discovered in the early 1900s, the FDA made it a requirement to add back in synthetic B vitamins into white flour to prevent vitamin deficiencies. Now, you know, adding back in synthetic B vitamins into the white flour is not really a long-term solution. It just maintains just minimal nutrient repletion so that children aren't born with developmental disorders. But ultimately, we're, taking out the best, most nutrient dense aspects of the food in order to make white flour. So it's really a destructive process overall. And then you can see here that here's a kernel of wheat. So the endosperm is what's the only thing that's left over after the milling process, and that's what makes white flour. And the germ and the bran on the outside are what contains all the nutrients, and those are taken out. So this kind of shows you the before and after. So before, we start off with whole grain wheat, and then through the process we remove the bran, the middlings, the germ oil, and we're left with white flour. So nothing in nature is white, so the fact that it's white means that there's basically no nutrients in that food whatsoever. So here's a mineral comparison of different salts. Again, with white salt is essentially just sodium chloride. If you get iodized white salt, then they'll add an iodine, and that they basically needed to do that because when everyone was eating table salt back throughout the 1900s, people were actually developing goiter because their iodine was so depleted, and when the thyroid is depleted of iodine, it swells up. So we had to add back in iodine in order to prevent goiter from happening in the population. And you can see here's a table one, has the minerals that are in iodized salt. We have mainly just sodium chloride. We have some aluminum oftentimes and dextrose, which is no good. And basically these are stabilizers because when we add an iodine, the iodine can turn the salt purple. It can make it kind of taste bad. So the dextrose and aluminum allow for the salt to run easily and to kind of stabilize it. We compare that to Celtic sea salt, and we see how many more minerals are in Celtic sea salt than in refined iodized salt. So we get a lot more trace minerals from sea salt, and sea salt is actually gray in color, so it looks totally different than white salt. And then table 3 is Redmond salt, and we even have more minerals in Redmond salt. So it just goes to show you the difference between an industrial made product and the real products that, sea salt comes right from the ocean, and Redmond salt comes from the Utah salt flats, which were originally laid down when the ocean went up to the Rocky Mountains. So the natural product contains many more nutrients. This is an advertisement about iodized salt that was used in 1927 that basically, children were not reaching maturity because the population was iodine depleted. And again, as I said, many people, children and adults, developed goiter because of the iodine deficiency. And your thyroid is so critical for your metabolism and your overall development that had significant developmental effects on children. So again, adding in the iodine into the salt is useful. But it's kind of like adding in synthetic B vitamins to white flour. It's better just to eat natural foods that contain these nutrients inherently than adding them in as a chemical process. And again, we see here the ingredients of both Morton's iodized salt. We see salt, aluminum, sodium silicoaluminate is aluminum, which is a neurotoxin, dextrose, and potassium iodide, which is iodine. And then in table salt, we just see salt, which is just sodium chloride, and aluminum. So not very good nutrients in these salts. And then the sugar industry, again, the processing of sugar is a similar process where there's many, many steps along the way to get to refined sugar. You have to clarify it, evaporate, crystallize, dry, melt, decolorize, which oftentimes means bleaching, evaporating, separating, drying, all the way to get to white sugar. So many, many steps and a lot of nutrient loss from the original product to get to white sugar where there's very little nutrients. And then the refined vegetable oil production to make vegetable oil is a terrible process. You start off with crude oil that really shouldn't be made into oil in the first place, because it's, comes from soybeans or corn or cottonseed or rapeseed. And these are all surplus crops in our industrial food system that basically we have found a way to bleach and neutralize and bleach again and deodorize to get refined oil that can be used as a super cheap vegetable oil. Now, traditional cultures never used any of these foods because they didn't have these industrial processes in order to separate the oil from a seed like a soybean or corn that isn't a naturally oily seed. That's why the traditional oils consist of palm oil, coconut oil, olive oil, beef fat, which is tallow, lard, butter. These are oils and fats that could easily be produced at home without using these very intense chemical industrial processes. Okay, then we want to also talk about factory farmed animals. This photo is what's called a concentrated animal feeding operation, otherwise known as a CAFO. And basically this setup is how we produce super industrial meat in this country. Of course, you can see that the living conditions of these animals are very, very poor. They're kept in extremely confined areas. And the reason for this is essentially just to cut costs and to be extremely efficient. So it's a cost-saving technique that really has terrible detriment on the environment. When you have a feeding operation that's this contained, you get tons of methane production. All these animals are basically pooping on each other, and then it's very unsanitary, so it creates a lot of pollution. It's very unethical for the animals. And when you have animals that are contained in such a confined feeding operation, they tend to get sick because, again, they're pooping on each other. They're living in confined areas. So they end up getting diseases. So they are pumped with antibiotics. They're oftentimes pumped with hormones to help them to grow faster. So it's a really terrible process overall that you can avoid completely if you avoid industrial meat. So the reason why, and this is the last part of the chemicalization of food, which is basically the increased chemical additives in food. Another reason why we recommend organic food over conventional food is because the USDA organic food only allows 40 chemicals in the processing of the food. Conventional food, there's almost no limit. There's 2,000 plus allowed chemicals. I have read as high as 10,000 allowed chemicals. So, when we get organic food, we're cutting out all those possible additives that can be used in the manufacturing and production process of the food. And this is just to give you some examples of the kinds of chemicals that are found in conventional foods. So we see sulfites, nitrates, BHT, propylene glycol, which is an antifreeze, monosodium glutamate, which is a neurotoxin. RBGH is growth hormone used in cows. Carrageenan is a carcinogen. Most of these, or many of these, I should say, are carcinogens. Aspartame is a neurotoxin. Aluminum is a neurotoxin. So, and all of these food dyes are neurotoxins as well. Many of these food dyes have actually been correlated with ADHD. So we can avoid this entire process if we just get organic food, which only has a small list of chemical additives that are allowed in the production process. And then the last reason why our food has been depleted is because of loss of traditional foods overall. So we no longer eat foods like raw milk, whole grains, sourdough bread, naturally made sourdough bread, raw foods, sauerkraut, traditional fats, bone broth, liver, seafood. These are all foods that our ancestors ate a lot of, and many of them, especially things like raw milk and liver and sauerkraut, things like this, we no longer eat these to a large extent in our modern diets because our tastes have changed. We have industrial processes, so we don't have to, we don't have to make sauerkraut. We don't have to preserve any foods. Traditional people didn't have the means to pasteurize and homogenize and take off the fat of their milk. So they, the raw whole milk is what they got. They only had the technology to produce traditional fats like coconut, palm, olive, things like this. They used the entire animal. These were all, processes that were done out of necessity, techniques that were done out of necessity for their lifestyle and their livelihood. And now with, modern adaptations and modern technology in our food system, we don't rely on these traditional foods anymore, and they've kind of grown out of fashion. And unfortunately, all these foods are the ones that contain the most nutrients. So, we have a loss of the soil, the nutrient content of the soil. We have long transportation times because of the globalization of the food industry. We have lots of chemicalization of our food. And then we also have loss of traditional foods that contain the most nutrients. So you can see that through that process, we're losing an enormous amount of nutrients from farm to table. So Weston Price is one of our, he's one of our, I should say, heroes. He was a dentist who continuously found in his practice in the early 1900s that children were coming in with really deformed teeth and oftentimes developmental health issues. And he wanted to figure out what the problem was, and he had an assumption that it was coming from the poor nutrient quality of the American diets of the early 1900s. This was during the birth of vegetable oils and canning and white flour and white sugar and some of the industrial processes that are still here today. And he went around the world to all different places, and he basically compared people in a single place living off the land, eating traditional food, versus people in the same place eating westernized food that was exported to their country in the form of white sugar, white flour, canned foods, etc. And he found again and again that the people eating traditional foods that they evolved with off the land had perfectly healthy teeth, very few cavities, and very few examples of any chronic diseases at all. When the people who were eating the industrial food had many cavities, crooked teeth, and they were very susceptible to acute and chronic diseases like tuberculosis and rickets and other developmental issues. So this is a comparison of the percentage, it's actually the percentage greater amount of these nutrients, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, iron, and the fat-soluble vitamins in these different diets, the traditional diets compared to our modern diets. So we can see that Weston Price went up and he studied the Eskimos or the Inuits, and the percentage that they had of calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, iron, and the fat-soluble vitamins was significantly higher, as well as all of these cultures across the board: traditional Swiss, traditional Gaelics, Australian, New Zealand, Malaysian, Polynesian, Peruvian, and African. All around the world, no matter where he went, no matter what geographical zone he went to, he found that these traditional cultures were eating much higher amounts of the different nutrients. And he actually took samples and studied them. And that's why we have these numbers, because he actually calculated the amount of nutrients that were in their food. We can see one of the biggest differences is the fat-soluble vitamins. And that was one of Weston Price's main studies, or main findings, is that traditional food contains lots and lots of fat-soluble vitamins, mainly in the form of animal products, because animal products contain the fats that contain the fat-soluble vitamins, like milk and seafood and meat and other things like this. So There was early in the turn of the 20th century in America, there was, of course, still kind of a debate on what's the best diet, and many people thought a vegetarian or vegan diet was the best without animal food. And Weston Price totally closed the book on that one, because he found that the animal foods that these cultures were eating had so much higher amounts of the fat soluble vitamins plus other minerals, as we can see. So he took tons and tons of photos. This is a photo, I think, of a Polynesian boy. You can see that, this boy is living in a culture that lives off the land. They don't have modern technology. They don't have any modern dentistry. So he's never been to the dentist, and his teeth are perfectly white, straight, no cavities. You can see his facial bones are really wide. He looks very, very healthy. This is an example of an Eskimo couple, and this man is actually holding a seal skin that's filled with seal oil. And these people actually ate almost 100% animal food, because the winter was at least 9 months, and there was barely any vegetables or fruits that grew naturally on the land. So they mostly ate seafood and animal food. And they would actually dunk all of their food in seal oil, and the seal oil contained tons of fat soluble vitamins. You can again see how strong and robust and wide their facial bones are. So again, this couple is extremely healthy. Here are children living in the Swiss Alps, and you can see that they're all barefoot. And Weston Price actually commented on how the mountainside would get very, very cold, but these children would be running around in their bare feet, because they were so healthy, their metabolisms were running so efficiently. And in the Swiss Alps, they ate a lot of grains and a lot of dairy. The cattle, he noticed, would actually eat fresh growing green grasses off of the mountainside, and they would, as the snow melted in the spring, the cows would kind of follow the snow melt and the snow line, and they would eat the freshest green grass off of the mountainside, and that created a milk that contained high amounts of vitamin A and other fat soluble vitamins and minerals. So this population was extremely healthy. Again, you can see how wide and broad the children's faces are. And then these are two more photos. Again, this is I think this is an Eskimo woman. You can see how healthy she and her child are, and how straight her teeth are. And I believe this is a man from Malaysia, I believe, or the Polynesian Islands, could be one or the other. They relied a lot on seafood and good coconut fat and fats from various crustaceans and seafoods. He's holding a crab here, and you can see how built, beautiful this man's body is for his age. He's got gray hair. He's got all his hair. His hairline is great. Great structure overall. Very, very healthy. So we have 5 principles of a healthy diet: whole, alive, traditional, simple, and strong. And these are our 5 principles to keep in mind to allow you to think about, how can I get more nutrients in my diet? Because, of course, it's a little daunting to think of how many processes are working against us that are depleting nutrients in our diets. But these are 5 principles to allow us to put nutrients back in our diets so that we can eat the best diets for health. So the first is whole. And the principle here is eat whole foods as they're found in nature. Pretty straightforward. In industrial processes, we're removing parts of the food, right? We're removing all the nutrients from the sugar to get white sugar, removing the nutrients from the flour to get white flour, removing the oil from various grains like corn and soy to get those oils. So you should eat foods in their whole form. And here are some examples. So examples of whole foods would be whole grains, right? Just as they're found growing right off of the plant. Whole raw dairy that's not pasteurized and homogenized, that contains all the fat right out of the animal, which you can get at a farm directly. And whole animals like meat, bones, and organs. If a traditional person slaughtered an animal, they'd eat the entire thing because they needed to survive. So that included the meat. They'd make bone broth out of the bones, and that bones contain tons and tons of minerals. And then they would also eat the organ meats, and the organ meats contain the highest concentration of nutrients in the entire animal, because the organs are so metabolically active that the body brings all the nutrients to the organs for their processes. So these are just some examples of how we should eat the whole food and how the whole food contains the most nutrients. Okay, number 2 is alive. We suggest that you eat 50% of your foods raw or pre-digested, otherwise known as fermented. So that's what we mean by alive. So here are some examples. Okay, fresh pressed juice is raw in its raw form. Raw salads, raw dairy, raw egg yolks in their raw form, meat and fish and whole grains, and fermented foods like sauerkraut. The reason why we recommend alive raw foods is that raw foods contain high amounts of enzymes, and our bodies actually absorb enzymes just like they absorb vitamins and minerals. So if we eat only cooked food, we're not getting any of those natural enzymes that are found in raw foods. And the cultures that Weston Price studied, he found that these people were consistently eating high amounts of raw foods, even raw animal foods like raw milk, raw meat, and raw fish. So we recommend that you eat 50% of your diet raw, and there's many ways to do that, which you can see throughout our cookbook. And the other thing I want to mention is that fermented foods are basically still raw. They're just in their fermented state. So you take, for example, to make sauerkraut, you take raw cabbage and you soak it in a brine over the course of a couple of days, and then it builds up a lot of probiotics, naturally good bacteria. So not only are you getting the good probiotics for your gut, but it also is still in its whole raw enzyme-rich form. So other fermented foods include miso and kombucha, and kimchi and other things like this. Traditional. So traditional means prepare foods using traditional techniques. Again, not only have we lost many traditional foods, but we've also lost many traditional techniques. And traditional techniques preserve nutrients in the food, so that there isn't a big loss with the preparation and cooking. So some traditional cooking preparations include soaking and sprouting your nuts, seeds, beans, and grains. The reason why we do this is because nuts, seeds, beans, and grains contain phytic acid and other enzyme inhibitors that are naturally found in high amounts in the grains and beans and seeds. And this is the reason why is because these are all essentially seeds to grow another plant, right? That's what we're eating. And these enzyme inhibitors keep the seed in a inactive form. So when we soak them, it basically neutralizes those enzyme inhibitors and releases various nutrients. So then it doesn't deplete our own enzymes, because the enzyme inhibitors, when we eat them, it depletes our own enzymes, and it can release nutrients, especially when we sprout. So you can do a longer soak, and then you can actually sprout certain beans and grains and seeds, and they'll actually grow a little sprout. Some will grow like long sprouts, and others will grow just short sprouts. And those sprouts have tons of nutrients, tons of enzymes, because basically at that point, the seed is trying to germinate into a full plant. So the plant produces many vitamins and enzymes in order to grow. So they're a great thing to add to your diet. Making bone broths, traditional bone broths from bones, and making your own homemade soups and stews is a way to not only get a much higher amount of mineral content in your food, but also to make your proteins more digestible. Because when you eat proteins like meats and other things like this with bone broth, the bone broth actually helps the protein to be digested. So making your own homemade bone broths and eating them regularly is a wonderful technique to get more nutrients. Like we already talked about, fermenting. This is some sauerkraut here. Fermenting your own food at home or buying fermented food is a great way to get nutrients. That's a traditional means of preserving food. And then sourdough bread. And sourdough bread is really the major form of bread that we recommend to our patients, because sourdough bread is a live food. It's basically naturally fermented, naturally risen from just yeasts in the air. And if you make sourdough bread from stone ground whole wheat, it's a wonderful food. Okay, number 4 is simple. So prepare meals with simple combinations. What we mean by this is that when we eat too many foods, our digestive systems can really not know what to do with that. It can kind of strain our system. And while the most important combination to keep in mind is your food intolerance combination, that's the most important combination by far. You can also improve your digestion additionally by avoiding things like proteins and starches together at the same meal, because proteins and starches are digested differently. So when we eat too many foods in one meal, like a Chipotle burrito bowl or something, or like a buffet, it can really strain our digestive system and strain our enzymes. And then the foods are being digested at different uh, time intervals, and that can cause digestive issues. So it's okay to do this some of the time, because again, the most important combination to avoid is your food intolerance combination. But we do recommend that to a large extent, you eat simple combinations and you separate proteins and starches if you can, eating just proteins and vegetables or just starches and vegetables, avoiding buffet style dinners, and just using less ingredients. Less is more. And then 5, strong. So what strong means is actually incorporating traditional fats and special nutrient dense foods into your meals in order to increase their nutrient density. So following all of the last 4 principles helps to increase your nutrient density, and then we can actually add in additional nutrient dense foods to increase the density even more. So examples of strong nutrient dense foods are traditional fats like tallow, which is beef fat, lard, which is pork fat, butter, coconut oil, and other traditional vegetable oils also count for traditional fats. Using high fat soluble vitamin foods like liver, raw milk. Butter has great vitamin A. Egg yolks have great vitamin A and other fat soluble vitamins. So using these foods liberally in your diet, if you're not intolerant to them. High mineral foods include things like seafood. Of course, all the minerals that are in the ocean are absorbed into seafood and seaweed. Molasses is another high mineral food. Molasses is actually the byproduct of the white sugar industry. So they take off the molasses, you know, from the sugar cane, and then the white sugar is what's left. So the blackstrap molasses contains all those minerals. So it's a very high mineral food. You can add that as a sweetener into your various dishes. And you can also add in high B vitamin foods as well, like nutritional yeast, wheat germ, which is the byproduct of the white flour industry, rice polishings, which is the byproduct of the white rice industry. So you can see how, adding in these byproducts that are taken out in industrial food preparation can actually increase our nutrient density significantly in our diets. And we have many, many recipes in our cookbook in the following section that helps you to figure out how to incorporate these various strategies, not only these various foods, but the other 4 principles that we went over in order to really increase the nutrient density of your food. So I hope that was educational for you, and I hope that through that explanation, you have a better understanding of why we spend so much time educating our community and our patients on the importance of getting nutrients in your diet because of all the ways that nutrients are depleted, and how we have to consciously put an effort forth to put the nutrients back in. Thanks, guys.